'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Might be coming down for sure.
Then the third thing we need to look at is whether a reasonable person would have taken precautions, okay? So whether a reasonable person would have taken precautions. So how do we work that out? This is a different test, right? This test, we're balancing 4 elements. Okay, so it's not an and test, it's not an or test. It's we look at these 4 factors and say, what would a reasonable person do given these 4 things? What are the 4 things we look at? The probability that the harm would actually occur if you didn't do what you should do. The seriousness of the harm. So like it's the difference between is the seriousness of the harm that you might stub your toe, right? Not much harm, or that you might die. Significant harm, right? So a reasonable person will obviously do more when the harm is seriousness. Just like a reasonable person will likely take more action if the probability is high, right? So we've got to look at probability, we've got to look at the impact or the harm. The third thing that we actually need to look at is how much effort is required to do something, right? What is the burden of taking precautions? Okay, so given this potential harm, given this probability, how much will it cost? Not necessarily just money, but what is the burden of doing something? If the burden is low, a reasonable person is probably going to take precautions. If the burden is high, a reasonable person will have to balance that against the harm and the probability. The final one that we look at is a really unusual one, maybe unusual to you, but it's the social utility of the activity. So what do we mean by this, the social utility activity? So there are some things that are risky that are good for society. So for instance, the courts have recognised that sports are inherently risky, okay? But there's a social utility in people playing sport. So that might need to be taken into account. The area where social utility often gets taken into account is, is with respect to emergency services. So most of the cases here are around something like the fire brigade. Imagine the lifesavers, right? Imagine that they're volunteers working on the beach, saving lives, and they do or don't do something. So they forget to take down a board to rescue someone, and as a result, someone drowns. Okay, sure, they should have brought the board down. But I tell you what, if you make them negligent for forgetting that board, then what you might have is a whole lot of people not doing the lifesaver activities anymore. Say, look, this is just too risky, we're not going to do it, right? So you don't want to discourage these kind of activities. So that's what that one's trying to capture. What's the social utility involved with this activity? And the higher the social activity, the more likely that you might not say that they breached their duty, right? Because they were doing good for society with what they were doing. Okay, so Section 9, Subsection 2 says we need to look at those 4 elements when working out whether a reasonable person would have taken precautions. And we've got a number of cases that I'll leave you to be able to read through at the back to give you examples of that. But again, we're looking at probability, kind of impact of the harm, how much it's going to cost or how hard it's going to be. A lot of those hard ones often deal with the government. And you think about, well, we know that if there's a lookout, right, with a cliff, well, there's a reasonable probability that someone could slip and go over the cliff. The seriousness of the harm is high. But could you really fence off every cliff in Australia, right? That's a very high burden of taking precautions, so probably not, right? That's the kind of logic that's used about this burden of taking precautions. So even when someone could die, the burden might be too high of actually taking precautions. Instead, the precautions you might take are, like maybe put a sign out, have a path that's not too close to the edge, those kind of things, which are reasonable precautions that you could take. And finally, the social utility, which I've talked a bit about. Okay, so that is the requirement number 2.